Hi, and welcome back. So we're just about to talk about values in Pride and Prejudice, but before we do, we thought we'd have a quick look at what class society actually looked like back then. So we have the upper class, which includes, of course, the royal family, barons and knights, and also the gentry at both upper and lower. So that would be about 200,000 people, and would include, of course, Jane Austen's family. Then we had the middle class. So those were people like the merchants, particularly the masters of industry in things like wool production. Then we had doctors, lawyers and teachers, so people who had to study for a living, but weren't very highly regarded in those days, as well as the clergy, which are people who are, taught in religious instruction, so people like priests. And that would be about 1 million people. Then we had the working class, who involved the shopkeepers, farmers, and of course, in this particular time period, a lot of military, and that's around 12 million people. And then finally we have the poor, who are the homeless, the pickpockets, the gypsies and the criminals, and they total 16 million people. So you can see that in this time period it may have been strictly controlled, but it wasn't strictly a very good deal for the largest portion of society. So, one of the values you see in Pride and Prejudice is this rigid adherence to class structure. So stability and the status quo was important. And this is seen in Darcy and Bingley in the decisions they make about marriage, particularly the fact that Darcy tries to talk Bingley out of marrying Jane, and also the fact that Lady Catherine believes that she has the right to interfere in Darcy's marriage. So Lady Catherine believes, being of higher class status, that it's completely up to her to run other people's lives. Social manners maintained class distinctions and prevented one from speaking freely about one's thoughts and feelings. Who could speak first at a dinner table, when to use the oyster fork, or what part of a lady's hand you were permitted to touch, were all determined by social rules. So this is seen in things like the fact that people refer to each other as Mr., Miss, or Lady, and some of the expression of emotions via letters as well. And of course there were the gentlemanly things like having to bow and rise when a lady entered the room. Economic marriages also feature very strongly in Pride and Prejudice. So upper class women were expected to marry for money and prestige, not for love. They would be coached in whom they could accept or reject by their families, so often the decision wasn't theirs at all. They would learn music or art as a means of self-betterment so that they could attract a husband. So in scenes where Elizabeth's sisters fight over who's going to play the piano and things like that, it becomes not just a matter of showing off their skills, but they're also spending time, it's almost like airtime so that they can advertise themselves for their potential husband. They were also not permitted to own or inherit land. So if their husband died, their home would go to the next male relative, who would hopefully give them an allowance and a small cottage to live in somewhere on the property. And this is easily seen in Mrs. Bennet's attitude towards Elizabeth marrying Mr. Collins. So Mrs. Bennet's pushing for it, not just because she wants Elizabeth to get married, but because Mr. Collins is going to inherit their house the minute Mr. Bennet dies. So if Elizabeth marries him, then there's a good chance that Elizabeth's mother and sisters will be allowed to stay on in the main house. But, of course, if she's rejected, then Elizabeth and all of her sisters and her mother will have to find somewhere else to live. So in short, women were ornaments with no economic independence and very little power. The characterization of Elizabeth seems to kind of go against this idea. She marries Darcy for love and seems to be a fairly independent woman. But Elizabeth can only obtain power or respect by emulating men. She often ridicules or rejects the traditional feminine pursuits, and she's very logical and very cold about her own emotions. Elizabeth also tends to idealise her father, even though he is quite out of touch with reality, and does little to protect or help his daughter's economic futures. So, if you think about it, Mr. Bennet doesn't really try and engage with Mr. Bingley or with Darcy, who might marry Jane or Elizabeth. He certainly doesn't do anything to stop Lydia from running off to Bath, and he doesn't really stop her from having to marry Mr. Wickham. So, when you consider the two parents, you start to see Mrs. Bennet in a completely different light. Maybe after all of her carrying on, she's the sensible one. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the 1980s, which is the cultural era for Letters to Alice. The 80s was a consumerist decade. The stock market was glamorized, so phrases like greed is good dominated the era. Fast food chains like McDonald's and KFC boomed. Corporate and government institutions were rife with corruption and sexual harassment. Arcade games, video games, and computers started to become a major industry. Pop music, music videos, keyboard synthesizers, and drum machines all meant that it was the era of the DJ. In fashion, we had perms, shoulder pads, leggings, leg warmers, hair gel for women and men, multiple bangles, and plastic jewellery. And the late 80s also saw the rise of the punk and the goth looks, which is probably more pertinent to Alice. So second wave feminism was a big influence on this era, so we're going to talk a little bit about how that all came about. Feminists believe that society is a patriarchy, so meaning a system that works towards male dominance or promoting male ideas, that oppresses women and other minorities. Feminists want to fix the underlying causes of these problems, such as stereotyping people's behaviour, language that is biased towards men, and equality in the workplace and at home. So the first wave of feminism was in the 60s civil rights movement, and it tended to deal mostly with legal issues, things like voting and making sure that people had access to the same services. The second wave was a lot more to do with social responses, so it tended to be things like family life, childcare, and workplace equality, and the way that people thought and felt about men and women. So it's very easy to see how this plays out in Letters to Alice. How patriarchal society affects women is examined through three different types of female characters. We have the feminist, independent Weldon, her seemingly dominated sister, who gets up at 6 a.m. to bake bread for her husband. And we have the young, independent and sexually free Alice, who quite happily has an extramarital affair with her professor. So Weldon studies their choices and their options, and contrasts these against the lack of choice with women from Austen's time. We also have the advent of something called critical theory. So that was part of 1980s literature studies and was the re-examination of classic texts for the way that they excluded minority points of view. So people writing critical theory tend to sound very dry and like they're writing essays, and it tends to be analytical and fact-driven. So if you've already read Letters to Alice, that will probably remind you of the essay-style writing that you find in the book. So one aspect of critical theory would be a feminist reading, and that's one that analyses how the genders are portrayed. Weldon's essays would probably be classed as a feminist reading, but they tend to be quite sympathetic to Austen. Some people would say that she's pretty mean to her female characters, but Weldon seems to make a lot of excuses for her. Another aspect that you'd think of is the economy at this time. The difficulties that a woman faces breaking into the literary industry are reflective of the difficulties women face in all industries. So the idea of the glass ceiling. So that's an idea that men are hired and promoted preferentially to women. So Weldon's view is quite cynical about this, and she bases a lot of this on her own experience in the industry, because after all, she is a female and she is a published author. Now, it might surprise you to know that that is probably quite a valid fear, and even continues to today. So the very famous author J.K. Rowling of the Harry Potter series was encouraged by her publishers not to use her first name because they didn't want the people buying the book to automatically know she was a woman, because apparently if a book is very obviously written by a female, young males won't buy the book. So perhaps that advice was fairly sound. So then we have the notion of individualist punk counterculture. So what we mean by counterculture is directly going away from social norms. And so that's sometimes fairly in your face, and it can be even a little bit impolite. It's a late 80s phenomenon embodied in Alice, who of course has green hair and piercings. This shows differing notions of beauty that are acceptable at the different times, and also what is acceptable in the presentation of a young girl. So in Austen's day, young women are supposed to be fairly submissive and quiet, whereas in this time period, it's obviously quite fine for a young woman to go against the flow. And then finally, we have the mentor relationship. So between Alice and Faye, we see that Faye believes that she needs to prepare Alice for a hostile patriarchal world. However, Alice is free to accept or reject any advice that Faye gives her, and often rejects it. And even though she does that, she still manages to get herself published. So maybe what this means is that a young woman is not always a victim, and they might be able to forge their own way in the world. So Faye Weldon has probably set this up so that the book has a very positive and upbeat ending. So those are the values in Pride and Prejudice and Letters to Alice. If you feel like you need more help with these texts, please check out our free resources at www.primeeducation.com.au.